Hello and welcome to Holy Wars, a podcast about religion, coexistence, and the people trying to figure it out. My guest today is Ismail Royer, an American Muslim and director of the Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team for the Religious Freedom Institute. In 2003, Royer was indicted for assisting the Pakistan-based Lashkar-e-Taiba and served 14 years in prison. He now works to promote religious pluralism and help people not fall into extremism. This is the longest episode I have ever recorded on the podcast, and in my opinion, the best. Ismail and I talk about fatherhood, the psychology of extremism, his journey from Catholicism to atheism to Islam, his time with the Bosnian mujahideen, his decision to recruit for the LET, his subsequent arrest, and his debates with terrorists in prison. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe, rate it 5 stars, share it with your friends, and donate to my Patreon. Thank you. And welcome to Holy Wars. Ismail, how's it going?
It's going very well. Thank God.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for chatting with me. I know we've been following each other on Twitter for a while, so it's actually good to know you're a real person.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out who you are for a long time. I saw your shenanigans with Pakistan and stuff,
yeah.
And I just I couldn't tell what was going on. You're an interesting guy for sure.
Yeah, it's I'm interested in a lot of different things, and so I just go with it, and then I think I've accumulated a lot of it'd be hard if I got killed to find out who did it. I always think I feel like there's a lot of different beefs I have and sides and things. Like my Wikipedia page, which I didn't create, is very confusing.
I have to check that out, but yeah, you're doing something right if you're killed and no one can figure out who did it. Which I
feel like the list of suspects would be very confusing.
Yeah, it's like I was going to say that movie Airplane with the long line of people with different baseball bats and stuff.
Right.
about to clobber the lady in the seat. But anyway, maybe that's not a good reference.
So I was saying before we started recording that I've got Jewel in the background. My wife's working from home today, and we've just got her because basically I'm like a stay-at-home dad when I'm not traveling, which is actually really nice. And so happy Father's Day to you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. And you and your wife are expecting, right?
Yes, in next month. So.
Wow, that's really quick.
Yeah, yeah. Welcome edition. Inshallah, we're going to call him Ali.
Okay. Is that
yes.
pretty normal to announce the name before it's born?
I don't think so. I think we're just excited, and it's like, you feel the child moving around in the in her belly, and it's just you feel like him already, and so it just seemed like the thing to do, and of course you already you think of. You sit around thinking of baby names, and it was, we came to a consensus pretty quickly on this. So it just didn't seem like, any reason to wait any longer. He's Ali, and that's right. That's what it'll be, I guess. Yeah. Yeah,
and it's you would have to kind of remind yourself every time you talked about your child whether you would be trying not to say Ali, right? And so this way you just kind of just do that. My wife is expecting our child is due on Thanksgiving, and we will find out. Thank you. And we will find out the gender when it gets back from college. We'll find out in about a month. What the gender is, and then we will. We haven't decided whether or not to announce the names, because like growing up I never heard of anyone announcing the name before the baby's born, but then like on Twitter I have all these traditional Catholic friends, and I don't know if it's anything related to that, but they all announce the names almost, and then when one of them has a miscarriage, they're all talking about that, and they have the name clearly out there. And so that's very new to me. So I don't know. We have the names picked out for, which one, if it's a boy or a girl.
Yeah.
So we know the names probably, that it's going to be called, and then of course it'll change it. It'll change the name later whenever the baby converts to Islam.
Yeah. Well, right. I also have to say that I think that it might be in some way related to this app that we have that's now like, it tells you like the different stages and it wants you to like put in a name.
Right.
So like it keeps sending these little notifications like Ali Ismail Royer is now the size of antelope or whatever.
Yes. Oh, that's so funny. Like, my wife and I have that app, and it's like, what I hate is that it'll say, the baby is the size of an apple. And you're like, okay, I can kind of see that. And then it'll be like, your baby is the size of a squirrel. And I'm like, what size squirrel?
It's like, it's as long as a piece of string or something.
Yeah. And there's it's actually not that helpful.
There's no reference point.
Right.
Like I've seen very large spaghetti squashes and very small spaghetti squashes.
Exactly. That is exactly what it's like. And or it'll say it's just, and it'll name some like marsupial that I've never even heard of, and I'm like, well, thank you. I don't know what your target demographic is.
Yeah. So through that, it's just sort of, it's like it's already this app has already sort of created the identity of our child, which is kind of scary in a weird way,
Right. I always wanted it to first of all, the app. When my wife was like 6 weeks pregnant, it said, you may think that you're starting to show yet, but it's not. That's not the baby. And you're like, thanks, app, for telling my wife she's fat, right? It's like, it's just the weight you've gained. You're like, thanks, I appreciate that. But I always wanted it to like continue, after the baby's born, telling you like your child is now the size of like a horse or something, like a Shetland pony. Like,
your child is now the height of a Prius.
Yeah. Like, wow. How do you know that? So I have to get something off my chest, and I don't know. From what I have heard, this is also common among Muslims, although I think it might play out a little differently. But yesterday, my wife and I were at Mass, and this Jewel was making noise, and not like a ton of noise. She wasn't screaming, and it wasn't during the homily, so it's not like you really had to pay attention too much. And this guy behind us leaned forward and dead-eyed my wife and said, you need to leave now. Like, you need to take her out now. And my wife got really upset, and I didn't know why my wife was upset, and so I thought it was because of Jewel or because of something else, or like, just. And it wasn't until later in the service that she said what he said, and like when we went up to receive communion, and then on our way back, like he and his family like disappeared, like they didn't come back to the pew, and so I never got to like confront him, but that's been like a very common beef of mine, is people complaining about the sounds of children during church. And it's so bizarre to me, but it's also just this like hostility to children that I think we have as a culture. And then I started getting all these responses of people who had experienced this in mosques, and so I didn't know if you had experienced this at all.
Oh yes, that's definitely a thing. I mean, but I think there are different. Let's say like extremes there. So it's one thing if you've got a bunch of little kids running around playing in the mosque while you're praying, and I think that's a beautiful thing. Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. That's almost, if you. It's all in how you receive it. If you're open, if your mind is open and your heart is open, and you receive that sort of cacophony in the background as what it is, which is just the joy of innocence and life, of these beautiful little creations of God, then it will it won't distract you. It will increase your your consciousness of your prayer and increase your connection. But on the other hand, if you receive it as kind of a in the mentality of a sort of person who's preoccupied with his or her life and things that annoy them and and things that annoy you and things that aggravate you, and you just have an overall disposition, which in fact that disposition is not that's not a holy disposition. That's not a disposition that you really want to be facing God with in the first place. So there's that. I think that if a person hears kids playing in the background and is aggravated and annoyed and distracted, then they really need to check themselves and they need to check their own heart. But on the other hand, like in Ramadan, not this year but last year, when we were going to the mosque for the Tarawih prayer, which is the every night in the mosque the imam will recite 1/30th part of the Quran and people will stand in prayer and it's usually lasts about an hour or so, and so there's this thing, at least in our area, where people will bring their kids, and I'm talking about like junior high to high school age kids, and won't supervise them, and they'll be just running around in the mosque in the background, screaming and shouting, and and like it's like at this point I'm not thinking about like joyful
right
joyful cherubim at this point I'm thinking like I'm gonna go
and
back
these are kids who are reasonable. They could be disciplined. They could respond to
exactly. I have a couple of funny stories. Like I had my son Hamza. I have 4 other children. Before
how old are they?
So I have one who's 20. I have one my daughter Fatima. She's 20. Her brother Hamza is 18. His younger sister Aisha is 17, and then the youngest is Hassan, and he's 16, and then Ali is on the way now.
That is some Catholic spacing. I don't mean to say that, but it's 20, yes. 18, 17, 16. That, like, any old Catholic woman would be very excited.
Yeah, they came one right after the other. So Hamza, when he was probably one and a half maybe, and I had him in a mosque in Bosnia, and we're sitting in the mosque. You sit on the floor, and it was during Jummah, the Friday prayer. So he goes. So we're in Bosnia. These mosques are like sort of the Ottoman variety, and the Ottoman style mosques. They have like the minbar, which is the pulpit, is like it's like 20 something steps up. Not that many, but it's really really high. It's normally like in Arab style mosques, it's not that high, but in like sort of Ottoman tradition, you go up all these steps, and I think it kind of somehow represents like the imam ascending up into heaven or something as he's I don't know, that's kind of the impression I got of what it's supposed to symbolize. Anyway, so he goes, Hamza, I let go of him on accident, and he goes cruising over there, scrambles through the crowd of old and young men, and then like just starts going up the steps up to where the imam is, and some old man like starts shaking his fist and got really angry.
That's great. That reminds me of a picture of there's this really great picture of Pope Francis, and I don't know if he's saying mass or if he's just speaking to everyone, and behind him on his throne is like a little kid with Down syndrome that had just like wandered beautiful. Up there, and Pope Francis is just like whatever, and it's just like this really great picture. Now you bring up,
the Prophet Muhammad.
No, go ahead.
The Prophet Muhammad used to carry his child, or his hold them, or his grandchildren while he was praying, and I used to do that too, and you see people doing that still, just to follow that example, while they're praying and holding their child, and then, another funny thing happened. Like we're in the mosque, like we line up in rows. Mm-hmm. So sometimes when you stand for the in the row, and then people will put their keys and their cell phones and stuff down on the ground, so that stuff isn't in their pocket while they're praying and annoying them. Yeah, so it'll be like on the ground in front of them. So this little girl, she comes running through the line, running down the line, grabbing everyone's keys and everyone's cell phones, and like just collecting them randomly and piled them up in a little pile somewhere.
That's great.
Anyway, a lot of funny things like that happen.
That's great.
Yeah.
You bring up Bosnia, and it's interesting. You grew up in St. Louis, right?
Yes.
But so it's interesting to me that you didn't grow up Muslim, but you did grow up in St. Louis, which has a huge Bosnian community. And I didn't know that until, I started traveling a lot and I started performing for various Muslim communities. And it's interesting, like each city in America has like a different like ethnic concentration. Like you'll be like, oh, this is where all the Bosnians are. But so tell me about your upbringing, like how you were raised in terms of your faith. And
well, I was born and raised in St. Louis, and when I was growing up, it was, ethnically speaking, really just black and white. That's all it was. There was one area of St. Louis that is Italian, but that's really the extent of ethnic diversity of St. Louis. I mean, I think I knew 2 Hispanic kids when I was a kid, and the third Hispanic person I met was in high school. And that was one girl from Nicaragua. So, really, the diversity was almost nothing, and of course it was a very segregated town at that time, housing wise and school. In school, I was raised Catholic. My mother was
interesting.
My mother was a nun actually when she was younger.
Oh wow!
She went into the convent at 16 and stayed until she was about 25 or maybe 24 or something like that. Yeah, it was a very, very strict order. They had vows of silence. Took vows of silence, and I went back there recently, about a year and a half ago, to visit, because my mom passed away in 2015. So one of my sons, Hassan, and my father and I drove out to Oregon from D.C. that's where my mom was from Portland, Oregon. We drove out there to, visit, to visit my mom's sister, who was very sick at the time. She's since passed away. But, while we were out there, I wanted to go visit the convent that she had spent so much time at, and that it had meant so much to her. And I saw the chapel where she used to, where she would have prayed, and I saw the school. There's a Catholic school attached to the convent. Where the nuns teach, and so I saw the school that she would have taught at, and it was really nice to see her. And I didn't meet anyone there still who knew her when she was there. There were some nuns I think who might have known her, but they were all in their rooms. But anyway, so my mom, she left Oregon, and she came to St. Louis to go to Harris Stowe Teachers College, which is actually a historically black college, which is really interesting that my mom did that. Yeah, I never got the chance to ask her about that, but what sort of prompted that or whatever. But anyway, she did, and she went out there to study. Came out to St. Louis to study education. Well, my father, meanwhile, he was raised in the Church of the Brethren, which is an Anabaptist denomination. Yeah, and he was born in Central Illinois. And my father's side of the family originally is from Pennsylvania, going back, till they came to America from Germany in around 1735 or something. And they were Lutherans originally when they came. They were part of that wave of Protestants who left who left France, the area of France and Germany after the revocation of the decree of whatever, I can't pronounce it, but it was the decree that allowed Protestants to practice their faith, and the king revoked it, and so they all.
Edict of Nantes, I think.
Nantes, that's it. Yeah, so they all so they fled, and he came to my ancestor Johann. Michael Royer came to Philadelphia in 1730 something, and so anyway, they eventually that branch of the family migrated to Illinois, and somehow along the way converted to Church of the Brethren. So my father got a degree in photography, and he moved to St. Louis and started up a little photography studio. And he met my mother, who was doing modeling for some sort of advertising or something as a way of making her way through college. So that's how they met. And
this is while she was still a nun, or she had left?
No. She had left the convent.
Okay.
And yeah, she had no. That would have been a scandal.
I'm trying to imagine these nuns yeah.
No, that would have been scandal. Yeah, no, a scandal or something. No, but
or she'd just be modeling like the latest habits and trends.
Habits, yeah, exactly. Yeah, something like that. Or the latest clunky black shoes or something.
Right, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, no, but she, so they met that way, and I was born in 1973 and raised in my mom's faith. My dad, I guess, didn't really have, didn't care that much, I guess. So I grew up going to Catholic schools and also private schools or Catholic schools. I moved around a little bit, but and I was raised Catholic. Yeah. So when I turned around about the age of 13 or so, I started getting into the punk rock scene, and the reason I think for that is that I had been going to a lot of schools with some very wealthy people, and I was myself pretty poor and lower middle class. I wouldn't say poor. I mean, there were times when I was really leaner than other times, but I'd say lower middle class, white kid, and going to the school with these rich kids, it was sort of difficult because especially when we all became aware of our relative statuses, and
there's
wealth
a moment,
and so on.
I think, when you realize that you're we have different amounts of money.
Yeah, exactly. I'm getting invited over to these kids, for example, my friend, his father was like a hotel, magnate or whatever. And I'm going over to his house, and he's got this literal mansion. I mean, it's just a colossal, fortress, and then I can't invite him over to my little, 2-bedroom apartment, right. So it's, so it's just and then it wasn't just that. It was also that they, kids start noticing that you're not wearing polos, you're wearing Garanimals or something. So
for me, my best friend growing up was poorer than I was, but we both had this idea of what a rich person is like, and the main thing that we focused on was that rich people have refrigerators that spit ice at you, that have a little cup thing where you put your cup and the ice comes out. And for us, that was the clearest. My mom, who grew up poor, for her, she thought that Neapolitan ice cream was fancy.
Wow! Yeah,
3 different flavors in one package. So
we all have. Yeah, and my mom was actually working at McDonald's for a time. So we were struggling to make ends meet. And so for me, I think what I just decided was I wasn't going to try. I would try and. It wouldn't work, so my mom would, I asked my mom one time for a polo, sweater or something, and she saved up for a long time to get it. And then I go to school with my polo sweater, and they're I'm noticing that people are wearing, they got different polo sweaters for every day of the week. You know what I mean? Right. I only got one. So I was at some point I was you know what, this isn't even, so what attracted me to punk rock was it was sort of this, I don't care what anyone thinks. I'm going to do me. And so it's funny that I like to think of myself as someone who really is just, concerned about let's say like the ultimate, about meaning and what is meaningful, what is important, and not about what other people think. But then it's sort of like I have to ask myself, is all that just a conceit? And in reality, it's sort of like that was just because I didn't have any money. Maybe if I'd have been born a rich kid, I'd be a conformist.
Right? Yeah.
Oh no.
You didn't have enough money to sell out, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I was forced to be an original. So So anyway, regardless, I do think though that it was something about that punk movement that was really, it really spoke to me, not just obviously about the money thing, but also it was just really, it was this emphasis on creativity, doing it yourself, questioning things, and questioning things is really good in a way, and it is also, but it's also not for everyone. It's sort of, like, but anyway, just so what happened is I just started questioning everything, and began questioning my faith, and it didn't help that a lot of the music I was listening to was sort of like, and punk is interesting because there are different flavors to it. There's like sort of more conservative, and there's also more like, leftist. So I was listening to a lot of like this, anarchy in the UK, I'm an antichrist, and or even like which is like the nihilist version, and like the the Marxist stuff. So I was like, I'm starting to like learn about foreign policy from like from like the like the dead Kennedys, which is not realizing that I'm that's one perspective and not necessarily the whole story. Although they were onto something in a lot of ways. But anyway, so I ultimately, long story short, came out of this phase being an atheist. And so, I didn't even come out of it. I stayed in that phase until about 18 or 19. And I had begun to look at religion as something that was, just used to control and manipulate people, and that I was too smart for that. That's the thing. I was too smart.
And how'd your parents process all of this? You're an atheist from around 13 through 18. That's like,
yeah. Well, what it is that really I didn't. That coincided with a period of time when I really stopped talking with them about anything like that. And also it coincided with the time when we kind of stopped going to church as a family. I don't know why exactly that happened, but I think it just, I think we just changed as a family. Where we stopped doing those things, and we stopped talking as much. And as me and my sister and I, who was the same age, we started going through these, adolescent phases, and there was the tension in the house, and there was the, it wasn't the happy, family anymore. We would all pile in the car and go to church. So now it was like, you going to church? No, I was out last night till 5 in the morning, and whatever. So so anyway, I think I never really discussed that with my mom at that age. I never said, I don't believe in God anymore, or it wasn't like a big, coming out type of thing. It was just I was just doing my own thing, and so.
And so, but then around
go ahead.
Well, around the age of 18, 19, you converted to Islam?
Yeah. So, definitely, it never really sat well with me being an atheist. And I think I'll say that I never really sat down and said, all right, what are the reasons that I don't believe in God other than that I'm too smart, for religion. It was more like, I didn't put that much thought to it. And, at a certain point, what really started getting to me was that I couldn't figure out what was right and what was wrong. In my mind, I was, in my mind, I'm like, okay, what is, is smoking marijuana? Is that moral or is that immoral? For example, I remember thinking, like, as a kid, I would have thought that was wrong, that was bad, and then, and now I'm like, I don't know, and not only that, I don't know why anything is right or wrong. And so I was feeling this sense of, okay, so for example, I'm really against racism. I'm really against, Rodney King the situation was going on at the time. I'm really against that. Obviously, I'm really against these things. But why am I against these things? What is my criterion? And so that was sort of disquieting for me, because in other words, I began to actually think about things, and I began to think about these deeper meanings. Also, like the fall of the Soviet Union, which was really interesting to me, because it was like, here's this here's this belief system that people, held as almost a religion and built an entire, empire on it. It all just utterly, collapsed into nothing. So what is true? What is right? What is wrong? What do I actually believe? And at the same time, I started listening to, there's a group called Bad Brains, which is a DC-based African-American punk band that was just, it's the best punk band that ever existed, without question. But what's really interesting is they were Rastafarians, and so all of their songs, instead of being like the other, like I'm an Antichrist type of stuff, or it was more like we can't lose with God on our side, and so I choose to read the Holy Bible, so I'm like, but it's like set to this like just raging music, and I'm and so as I'm listening, I'm sort of like
it's appealing to something transcendent.
Yes, exactly. Like, there's one song that really okay. So they have this song that says, "Where, oh where can God's love be found, my dear? It's here in the underground." So and it was called House of Suffering. In this house of suffering, we got to let some joy in. So it's really it was really starting to speak to me as I started to listen to these lyrics, and so I actually started picking up the Bible again and reading it, and it also kind of reminded me. See, this is the other thing, is like I actually started believing in God again, because I was reminded that I believed in God. It wasn't like some, I'd had a series of, I had a friend who was Muslim, and eventually I met a guy who was Muslim, and we became very close friends. And he's the one who I eventually became Muslim as a result of sort of, encountering him. But we used to argue about, we used to debate, does God exist? Does God not exist? And I realized that, like, that wasn't getting me anywhere. What really got to me was those things that spoke to awakening memories, so I have on my Twitter, my pinned tweet is like a picture of a bird, and it says ex-atheist. Yeah. Ex-atheist because, and I get all these like, atheists like commenting on it. Oh, so you believe in God because there's pretty birds,
that bird evolved from this. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And I'm not actually, this is not actually an argument from design or something like that. In reality, it's just that, I see things like that in this creation, and it reminds me of something I already know, which is, Plato talked about that, and Augustine talked about that, and and that's it's there's something that was there's an innate knowledge that we human beings were created with, and that we have, and that the signs in the creation can awaken that memory in us. And it's really, I don't find these arguments for, I shortly after converting to Islam, I had I had a philosophy class in Philosophy 101, which I got the highest grade that anyone had ever gotten in that class, by the way. And as I started the class, the teacher, the professor's like his entire goal, he explained from the very beginning, was to convince everyone that God does not exist. And his method was that he went through all of Aquinas's proofs and showed how they didn't actually prove that God existed. So I kept actually, like, the whole class, the whole course, I was arguing with the guy or debating with the guy in class. I'm like, I agree with you. I agree that doesn't prove anything about God's existence. As a matter of fact, I can explain that proof to you. I can explain why that proof is wrong better than you can. But at the same time, that doesn't mean anything either. And so it was really interesting because I had all these Christian classmates that would start, they would feel agitated when he would start, and then by the end of the class, they would keep looking to me to try to, like, rescue their faith. So I came out of that class stronger, than I was before. And what it was about Islam,
that's a good like microcosm of like the geopolitical situation right now, where like all the Christians are like, do Muslims have good arguments for why secularism's bad?
Yeah.
Like it's like, I think it's there's something poetic there.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. You know, it's that now that you mention it. Yeah, actually, think about it. That really does reflect now 2019 and what I'm actually doing and trying to do. You know, so why did I choose Islam? It's that, you know, I read the Quran, and to me there were passages in it. I mean, everything that I read reminded me of things that I had that I believed, you know, and I, for example, when it came to, I mean, so much of the content of the Quran is relating to, at least when it comes to historical discussions, related to Abraham, related to Moses, related to Noah. So it didn't it was familiar to me, at least in the topics of the stories. And then the discussions of let's say God's attributes and so on, that seemed familiar to me. The explanation of Jesus and his nature, that also struck me as making sense, because I had struggled with the concept of the Trinity when I was younger. Now, having read deeper and having read Augustine and so on, I and gotten past the middle school Catholic school explanations for the Trinity, and now seeing more things that I could appreciate a little bit better. I think I understand where that's coming from, but nevertheless, it didn't correspond to what my beliefs were, what I believe to be true. And the Islamic concept of Jesus, it made more. I just have to put it bluntly. It made more sense to me. Mm-hmm. And then the Muslims that I met when I wandered into a mosque to ask questions, and the Muslims that I met were really good people, very decent people. And so that can certainly go wrong, because there are absolutely many Muslims who are not good and decent people, but the ones that I met were the ones I needed to meet. And the first person that I met when I walked into a mosque to ask about Islam was Umar Lee, who was a formerly more well-known sort of personage, I guess. But he's still out there. He's laying back a little bit. But so Umar Lee is a fun and interesting character, to say the least. Definitely an interesting guy. So he was the first person who was in that mosque, and I walked in there and asked him about Islam, and we became friends. This is back in '92, and from there it just kind of went. I at the same time, I was tired of getting high every night and playing in a band, in a punk band and stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I'm 19. I'm not 16 anymore. This is getting really old. So it kind of coincided with as well. It's changing friends. I got off doing drugs totally, which was a very good thing. Well, honestly, it took a little bit to quit smoking weed. It took a few months before that happened. But anyway, so yeah, that's the rest is history. And you asked about Bosnia. Well, I mean, Bosnia. These Bosnian refugees started coming into St. Louis at around the same time that I converted, around '92. So they started flooding into the city, and I started helping. Volunteering at the mosque, and I'm helping these guys, men and women and families connect with social services, taking people to, the doctor's appointments, taking them to, to get food stamps, taking them, to find apartments and, find furniture. And my dad was even helping. We had a pickup truck, so we'd, go, pick up donated furniture and take it over to their houses and stuff. And I just sort of started getting to know these people and really liking them. And, it also kind of resonated with me that they were Europeans and I was of European descent. So it, sort of like what was really neat about that was, they didn't feel, for them, it was just their Muslimness or their Islam was so natural to them, and it was just part of who they were, for me, going to a mosque of, where I'm going, it's like Pakistanis and, Arabs.
Right.
And,
these are people who could pass for white or are white or.
Right. Yeah, they are white. I mean, they're European. Exactly. And even African American converts, like there's something about Islam that for the African American convert, it's so normal and natural. It's just a very easy fit for them. But then it's not quite the same when you're a white convert because I don't know. I guess just historical reasons. Just historical. But then when you meet these, you meet Bosnians and you meet Albanians and that sort of thing, and it's just not. There's just to the extent that actually they don't even they'll many of them don't even. Some of the let's say less religious and more just sort of culturally Muslim people they don't even consider people Muslim who aren't Bosnians. I mean, I wouldn't say that not to that extreme, but they're just, I mean, so it's just really interesting, and so yeah, I married a Bosnian woman and we had children. I went, as you may know, I went to Bosnia in '94 to volunteer in the Bosnian army.
What was that decision like? I mean, to me, I'm trying to sort of understand the arc of your story, which is really fascinating. And at this point, everything to me seems pretty normal. And then, right? I mean, it seems like something. I mean, maybe I just have weird friends, but to me, it seems like okay, and you convert to a different religion, and you fall in love with this, Bosnian woman, and then you're like, okay, and then I joined the army. In the Bosnian army, and I'm like, well, how's that? Okay, well, yeah. What is that? What was that decision like? And do you see that as a normal sort of valid movement, or was there something that changed?
Well, what happened is that I got married later after I went to Bosnia. But what happened is that I was. I had just become really, I think, obsessed with the Bosnian War. I mean, it just, first of all, working with these refugees and taking people to psychiatrists and taking people to doctors, women who had been raped, and and then hearing the stories of what was happening, and and what really as well, I think, did it for me was the Newsweek cover with the inmates of the concentration camp that the Muslims and that the Serbs were holding, and then there was an article in I don't know, it was some women's magazine like Cosmo or something like that, but about rape camps that were that the Serbs had, and so I was just like, oh, this is enough, And then I heard someone says to me, oh, there are Muslims, there are foreign Muslims, foreign mujahideen volunteer fighters in Bosnia, and people are going there, and that, in my mind, I was like, oh wow, maybe I could do that. And at that time, there were, you have to remember that. That was very shortly after Afghanistan, after the Soviets were pushed out, and then their surrogate Afghan communist puppets were pushed out, and there was still at that time in the American Muslim community and just the Muslim world in general a lot of sort of romantic feelings about the people who had gone, and about the Afghans and the volunteers who had gone to help. At that time we didn't know. Well, and
even I mean, not just Muslims, but Americans in general. Yeah. I think that Rambo is what was it? Rambo. Right. Is at the end.
Rambo it's 2 or 3.
Yeah. It's very jarring. At the end, it says dedicated to the brave people of the Afghan mujahideen.
Oh yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit difficult to take ourselves out of the framework of post 9/11 and post ISIS and think about what this meant at that time. But at that time, it wasn't. There was more like a freedom fighter, type of thing, the idea that people had, and and that was certainly true in the Muslim community. Like no one, people didn't think, oh yay, Afghan mujahideen, chop off heads, 9/11, destroy a World Trade Center. It was although I will say at the same time, around 93, someone, when they did the first World Trade Center attack, and then there were some incidents in Egypt, and where these these fanatics were killing people and tourists and stuff. But I actually did not. To me, like those things, when I was seeing those things, I was thinking, these people are like some kind of fringe, psychos or something, so it's like at that time there wasn't that connection, between these people and the concept of jihad. To me, the concept of jihad at that time meant something related to my only framework for that was the Afghan Soviet conflict. So when I heard about this in Bosnia, I was like, oh, okay, so here's these freedom fighters now in Bosnia, and so I'll go, so what made me want to go join them? I think first of all, it was the personal contact with people that I had, but also I was just coming out of this frame of like hyper activism, anti-war activism, anti-racism activism. I was, involved in like all kinds of demonstrations and riots and, all this, so, when I had been a leftist, so I kind of like carried over that sort of like activist type of mentality, which can actually be very bad, in many ways. But I think that mentality is part of what made it even feasible for me to consider doing something as crazy as, or as like, let's say like, disruptive to my life, of going, so in any event, it's hard to look back and really fully understand what was going on in my mind. But so it
doesn't seem like to me, it doesn't seem crazy. I mean, like if I heard of Catholics being, victims of a genocide somewhere, and it was like a socially acceptable thing within the Catholic community for people to go and volunteer to fight. I don't think I'd go, because I think I'm probably not a good fighter, but like I think that like my if I had friends who were like ex-military or whatever who like were like, we're gonna go and do it, I'd be like, all right. Like, I mean, it would seem radical to me, but maybe that's just my personality, where like if something is if I think that that something is correct, then I don't attach social stigma to it. And also I was 19, I was I was at that age and that stage in life where you just sort of, as a young man, I was living in, first of all, I grew up in suburban St. Louis, so it's just, I'm like bored, so there's a lot of boredom, boredom, the boredom had prompted me to, go off and like get involved in some juvenile delinquent activities, and it's sort of like, you have all this testosterone, and you have all this life and all this energy, and you're bristling, and I'm sitting at that point. I had transferred to American University in Washington D.C. So I'm sitting in this poetry class, and they're talking about the Marxist interpretation of some poem or the feminist interpretation, and I'm just like this. I'm like this. I'm in traditional times. I would have been like, I don't know, like digging rocks out of my plot of land, or I would have been like, I would have been like off like fighting in in some war. I would have been, there's just this like, it just wasn't sitting with my nature, to be just sitting in this class while something important needed to be done, some big meaningful thing was happening, and for all those reasons, I just couldn't sit still, so I was just like, I got to get out of here. This is crazy. I got to go do this thing. So I wound up, I got the contact information for one of my friend's family, who was in Slovenia as refugees, and I went over there to Slovenia, which is one of the former republics of Yugoslavia, not far from Bosnia. And so I connected with them, and then I took the bus down to Bosnia, and
I got there, and the bus driver took me to the headquarters of the local Bosnian army in the city of Travnik, where the bus just happened to randomly stop. And then from there, they sent me off to a brigade of foreigners, and that's where I stayed. And I switched to another foreigner brigade at some point, but that's sort of where I was until the end of the war, which actually turned out not to be too much longer after that, about, I don't know, 6 to 8 months or something like that. But I did, I got infantry training, and then was put on the front line, and most of what I did consisted of holding down the line that I had been placed at, and repelling Serb attempts to take it, take the area the hill that we were on and stuff. So that's and then I got married there in Bosnia. I went home back to America after the Dayton Peace Accords were signed. I went back to Bosnia and got married less than a year later, and came back, brought my wife back to the United States, and we had 4 kids, and that's what happened.
I have a dumb question. Is that illegal to do? Like, is it illegal to go and?
Yeah, I mean, there are circumstances in which doing something like that is illegal. One of the things is that if the United States is neutral in a conflict and you go and get involved in the conflict, then you can be charged under the Neutrality Act, which I was actually eventually charged under the Neutrality Act for supporting Pakistan in its conflict with India. So that happened many years later, but
right.
But for Bosnia, no, because at that time the United States was not neutral. The United States was actually involved in at the end of the war was facilitating weapons transfers to the Bosnian military. They should have been doing that earlier in the war, but anyway, by the end of the war, they were doing that. So no one ever really, and also just people didn't pay attention to stuff like that at that time. There was, you had Soldier of Fortune magazine, if anyone remembers that, or I don't even know if it still exists, but it, but it was sort of about, there's this sort of like international, this cultural phenomenon of mercenaries and soldiers of fortune, that sort of exists. A lot of people from South Africa, and anyway, just it's a very strange culture. But anyway, that's a thing of like going around to different conflicts and participating in them. So it's definitely very murky and very gray area, and it was really Al-Qaeda, and it was Al-Qaeda that destroyed that, because there was a sort of, among Muslims, there was a thing of like, okay, so Bosnia, then there's Chechnya, and then there were these different conflicts that were happening in the 90s, 80s, and 90s where Muslims were sort of in a, for example, Chechnya, where they declare their independence, Russia invades, and so like here's the heroic Chechens that are fighting, and the United States supported them too at that time, in a very low key way, but diplomatic support and so on. So I mean, there was it was Al-Qaeda, and it was really the embassy bombings that began the process of stopping that. And I will say that, and I don't mean to romanticize that sort of like people going from conflict to conflict. I mean, I was romanticizing it at the time, but there's certainly that is certainly problematic, because what happens is that you have a lot of people running around going from conflict to conflict. It leaves open the strong possibility that some of these people will become loose cannons, especially when there enters into it some charlatans with ideological messages that can corrupt people. And what happened is that Al-Qaeda's ideology, the ideology of sort of nihilistic, hatred for humanity and this desire to just burn everything down and declare the rulers of the Muslim world and anyone who's, to be apostates, and anyone who doesn't declare them to be apostates are also apostates, and and so on. So I mean, this movement, which I had at the time, or this phenomenon, which I had seen as something noble, began to be something, turned into something very very ugly, and that whole. There were different, this is also, maybe this is sort of inside baseball, but there were different trends and different strands of thought within that group of of people who were international, sort of an international foreign legion of Muslims. There were those who were just sort of ordinary people. I mean, just ordinary Muslims that you would just meet. And then there were others who were like sort of like on the fringe of being like whack jobs, sort of like Zawahiri and these type of people. So those whack jobs essentially like won, I have to say. And then I think, they have really superseded. I could not tell you at this point if there's any of that sort of normal, fighters left. I mean, possibly like in Syria fighting the regime, but I don't know who they would be, and I haven't really bothered to try to sit there and figure out who's good and who's not. To me, it's all just very, very confusing, and I don't, I'm just really regretful at the chaos that has emerged from something that I saw originally as something nice, and something good, which was, sort of, like I said, of an international foreign legion,
Yeah. So when you look back at your time in Bosnia, your decision to go, it sounds like you see your decision to go as foolish and sort of a youthful kind of thing. But was there anything? I mean, do you regret going?
No, I don't. I don't regret it, and I don't think it was foolish. I think it was. Well, first of all, it's very important to note that I saw the Bosnian War as something very black and white, good versus evil. And the truth is that conflict was about as close to actually black and white, good versus evil, as human affairs get. I mean, it certainly wasn't entirely, because there is no such thing. I mean, there's everything involving human beings is some mixture of good and evil, with varying proportions of of good and evil mixed in, But the Bosnian War was very much, it was a genocide. It was an attack by evil people against innocent people, and not everyone on the Serb side obviously was. Equally levels of culpable, and there were actually very many decent Serbs, and then there are also very many bad people on the Bosnian side. But in general, I mean, to me it's something very similar to World War II of the Nazis. There's no one can sanely claim that the Nazis should not have been fought. I think the same way. I mean, no one can claim. There is no argument that the Serbs should not have been fought. With military force. And so I look at my involvement there as something good. I don't regret it at all. I can whatever. Perhaps it was youthful foolishness and so on, but regardless, it was. I still think it was a good thing. And well, the bad thing about it, right? The bad thing was that after I came back to America, and I was on this kind of I was in a new mode of existence. This new mode of existence was that I'm looking for the next Bosnia. I'm looking for the next really meaningful, exciting, exciting sort of, event that I can live in I can achieve this mode of, achieve these heights of, meaning and excitement and adventure again. And
it's almost like a drug. There's like war as a drug. There's a movie, The Hurt Locker, where the guy just keeps going back to war, and you see these friends of mine who are in the military who have enlisted and just gone back and back and back and back and back, and it's like they're there's something just exciting that they don't get, as a civilian.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I haven't seen that movie, but I need to. But yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, you can't go back. I tried to go back to, to college, and I'm again finding myself in this damn poetry class again, and what the, like I'm sitting there.
So far, I've got on your path to radicalization, it's punk rock and poetry class.
Poetry, yeah. That's oh my god, yeah, that's enough to radicalize.
You can tell Rod Dreher that feminist poetry interpretations are the leading cause of radicalization among Muslims.
Yes, yeah, exactly. No, that's very true. Yeah, very true. I just couldn't stomach it, So then, when the Serbs invaded Kosovo, well, they didn't exactly invade Kosovo, but when the war started with Kosovo between the Serbs and the ethnic Albanians, I thought to myself, aha, here's Bosnia again, and so I dropped everything and left my wife behind and my daughter, and I took off to Macedonia and was going to and tried to get from there into Kosovo, and didn't really work out because the Albanians were sort of not the same as the Bosnians. The Albanians, first of all, the Albanians who were fighting were communists, or former communists, former Leninists. Actually, it was like some faction of Albanians that the Kosovo Liberation Army was actually it had its origins in this militant Leninist Albanian nationalist group, and so this was they weren't interested whatsoever in people coming saying I'm here because my fellow Muslims, and there's what are you doing here? You're not Albanian, and get out of here, and so it was really somewhat of a disillusioning experience. And then of course the American bombing started of the Serbs, and so the Serbs were clearly losing. So there was no war any way to speak of to get involved in at that point. So I came back to America, and so when I came back,
it's interesting to me to think that your life would have been very different if Bill Clinton had not been caught with Monica Lewinsky, because that's like the standard explanation for why he bombed Kosovo was because that was.
I don't. Yeah, that is a theory. I actually don't agree with it, and the reason is this: that I think that Clinton was really stung. I think the Clinton administration, I think was really stung by the, the condemnation that he got from much of the world for not acting earlier in the Bosnian War to stop to try to stop the
and in Rwanda
And in Rwanda, exactly. So now, it was like I think he just wasn't, I think he wasn't going to sit by and have that on his record again. And I think that he did the right thing. I think for sure. I mean, bombing the Chinese embassy, was that okay? No, that wasn't okay. But I think that was now Sudan, and also people called, if you remember at the time, like when he. When they rocketed Sudan, it was like a pharmacy and something else, and they were they were calling those Monica missiles, but even there, it's like I don't think that's exactly right, because they just blew up the embassies, and so it's not unusual that there would be a response to that. But anyway, yeah. So I kept looking for so when Russia invades Chechnya for the second time in '99. I said, "Aha! This is the new Bosnia. This is what I'll do now." And so, my friend of mine and I decided that we would go to Chechnya and fight and join the Chechen rebels. And the Chechens had a huge amount of goodwill, among the Muslims for them. I mean, people really, really, the Muslims in general, really had a lot of admiration for the Chechens for fighting these, fighting off these Russians. And yeah, there were a few weird players in that, and there was the seizure of a hospital and, things like that didn't really sit well with me. But, you have a human being has a great capacity for willful blindness and for seeing what we want to see, and I also do think that didn't, those type of incidents actually don't reflect the entire, they don't stain the entire liberation or independent struggle of the Chechens, so I, when Russia invaded Chechnya again, I decided I would go there, and it turned out that what we learned was that the Chechens would not accept people who didn't already have military training. So my friend, he didn't have military training, so we decided that we would go to Pakistan first, to one of their, the training camps of this group, Lashkar-e-Taiba. I liked the people I was with. They were really decent people. And I will also as well say that, they seemed to me at the time, and I will also say that there are people within Lashkar-e-Taiba who are against. They're against suicide bombing for sure. That's just not. That's their way. That's their madhab, or their school of thought, is that they're against suicide bombing. And they told me that they were against killing civilians and attacking civilians, and even made very strong arguments against why they were against attacking civilians, in the same way that the Arabs had when I was in Bosnia, so they were, and that is a position within, a very strong position within the ancient, very classical Islamic jurisprudence, that those who do not fight are not to be harmed.
Right.
There were others who said there are others who said other things, had differed with that and said no, that's okay, but those are minority positions, and that's not what's generally followed. The general thing that is followed is that those who do not fight are not to be harmed, and certainly, and we're talking about men, certainly women and children and old people and religious priests, monks and so on. There's no question that they're not to be harmed. So when you look at Mumbai, it's like, okay, so not only did you go and you targeted just people sitting in cafes and stuff. They went and they attacked a Jewish house of worship. It's like, what conceivable possible explanation is there for this that would justify this? There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing, and it was purely evil, 100% from beginning to end. And I felt, because as I'll explain, I went to prison as a result of my involvement with this group, which I at least was able to tell myself at that time, at least these guys are some remnant of that, foreign legion I was telling you about that I used to believe in, that they're, because at that time I was like, I still absolutely don't agree with the way that India is conducting itself in Kashmir, but here's the other thing. It's like, so after I get involved with this group, because, long story short, I didn't wind up going to Chechnya at all. I wound up staying in Kashmir and supporting these guys. So to me, Kashmir was one of those causes that was, pure. It was sort of like, it's like Bosnia, or it's like, Kosovo, or it's like Chechnya. I mean, the reality of it is that it's actually, at least to me, it's not, it might be clear to some people, and, people who have their positions and so on. It's not clear to me. It's not clear enough to me now as I look at it that this was something that it's like Syria to me, like right now, or it's like, or something else. I'm not going to sit here and throw my weight behind any particular faction. Okay, I'm against Assad. Yeah, that's clear. But beyond that, I mean, I'm not against Assad enough to be, idiotic enough to say any one of these groups is that's fighting him is, obviously ISIS are soldiers of Satan. But I mean, are any of these other groups good? I don't know. I have no idea. But and I'm not even going to waste my time trying to figure that out because it's too murky. Now, this situation in Kashmir, at that time, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm going to put invest my energy in being against, India's occupation of Kashmir. But, I actually don't. I mean, Lashkar-e-Taiba, their position was that I don't know what it is officially, but it was that India should be part of Pakistan. That Kashmir should be part of Pakistan. Should Kashmir be part of Pakistan? I don't know. Is that what Kashmiris want? I have no idea. So and what percentage of Kashmiris want that, and so on. And so it just, to me, this was not a cause that was in and of itself something that was not that it's not worth getting involved in. It is worth getting involved in terms of just the rights of the people there, making sure that it's respected. But it's not something that I should have taken a position. It wasn't my place to take a position on that, I should not have actually gotten involved in helping this group. Even cutting out the fact that that Mumbai happened. I mean, just even at that time, it wasn't something like Bosnia. So anyway, I foolishly threw myself into this cause as if it were something like Bosnia, and wound up getting arrested for it, because after 9/11, when 9/11 happens, this was all pre 9/11. When 9/11 happens, and a bunch of my friends went off to Lashkar-e-Taiba, and I helped them get there right after 9/11. So you see, actually, let me just point out here something that you see, that like my initial desire to do good in Bosnia, and my sort of my obsession with not being able to live a normal life and wanting to live in this sort of like magical world of meaning and so on, and then this all begins to take me to places that I should have hit the brakes on, and what is it about me and that allowed myself to do that? I look at myself now as almost like a sort of Don Quixote type, who's seeing, he looks at windmills and sees dragons, or he looks at a procession of penitents and sees a bunch of giants or something, as Don Quixote did in a brilliant study of human psychology. And he really, if you want to understand why many people get involved in this sort of thing, read Don Quixote, because he was Cervantes was a brilliant psychologist in this. But there are other paths that people take to this sort of, if you look at like ISIS, or you look at people who get involved in Al Qaeda, this is actually that's not where I was coming from. That's not how I found myself in this situation. So that how people get involved in those type of groups, we can talk about. That's another question. But this is just how I got in this situation. So when I, the people that I helped get to Lashkar-e-Taiba after 9/11, these guys went because we heard I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we were back in America. 9/11 happens. It's a horrific thing. All of us, myself and all my little group of friends, were against it. And at this point, I was hanging out with a group of young Muslim men. We were playing paintball and going hunting and doing all kinds of like weekend warrior activities, and we were also really closely following the Chechen War. And this one of the guy who I decided to go off to the Chechen conflict with was part of that group. And we were not an anti-American
The paintball
group.
is what most people, I think, that I know.
Yeah.
That's the, like, I was, when I first heard about you and I was Googling, I was like, oh, the paintball thing.
Yeah. Well, we had this group, and we, it's about, the extended group was probably at about 40 of us in the Northern Virginia, DC, Maryland area. And we were all like these, 20-something, Muslim kids with a lot of energy and just starting to form families, and I think resisting the minivan, the minivan lifestyle, we struck up a sort of organically struck up a sort of friendship where we were all, we all knew each other from the mosques and stuff. And so we all had started this sort of like I say, like weekend warrior type of group where we were playing paintball. We would go off like canoeing on the Occoquan River. We would, we would go hunting, we'd go camping, we'd go off-roading. We all, like, a lot of us had like SUVs, and there was like, for some reason, a lot of us had Pathfinders, so we're like going off-roading in Pathfinders, and it was just a blast. We were having a lot of fun, but at the same time, we were also like the Chechen War was really big at the time, like I say, so we were all like really into into following what was going on there. And was there a level of militancy? I mean, in some degree, but it wasn't a militancy that would like make us like dangerous to neighbors and stuff like that. I mean, it's really, really difficult to explain in any way that makes sense to someone now, like, 20 years later, trying to explain this. But it was sort of like we were, we were just a bunch of weekend warrior types. Now, my involvement with this group was on a higher level, because they had looked up to me as someone who I had been in Bosnia. I had been, and then I went off to Kashmir and I come back. And so now I'm one of their group who's been off in Kashmir. So I now have this involvement with Lashkar-e-Taiba, and I was still involved with them at the time. So they were telling me, hey, if you know anyone who wants to come train with us, send them to us, So I'm encouraging people to go off to Lashkar-e-Taiba and go through their training camps. And so I have to say that I corrupted this group in a certain way. I took this group from a bunch of, just sort of weekend warriors and turned it into a sort of thing where, I upped the ante of the militancy, I have to say, and I turned it from something where it was just some sort of like weekend activities or whatever in Northern Virginia to something where people are going off to Pakistan and they're, so they were doing that. And LET had its own reasons for why they were, why they had an interest in people from, from America. There were Australians who were going there too. There were obviously, British, Pakistani people there, and there were these people coming from America. So for them, it's not that they're like recruiting people to go off and do things in other countries, because that's not really what LET is about. They're really focused on Kashmir. But what they were doing is just sort of, I think that first of all, I think it's public relations. A lot of their camps, especially like the lower level camps, are just sort of tourist, like dude ranches, if you know what a dude ranch is. You go and you pretend to be a cowboy for a weekend. So people go off there, they shoot, a gun at a paper target, and they, go tramp through the woods for a little bit. And but the important thing for LAT about that is not. They do actually train at their higher levels. They do train people to actually go off and fight against the Indians. But at these lower level things, it's almost more like a sort of propaganda for them, where people come back. They go through their little thing, they come back to their countries, and then they tell people, "Oh yeah, I was just with LET, and they're they're doing this, and they're doing that." It's almost like a sort of public relations.
Well, it kind of reminds me. There's things that Israel has where they. You can go and like spend a day with like the Israeli, the IDF, and like shoot guns and stuff and take pictures with guns.
That sounds really, really similar. It sounds really similar to that type of thing, and it's very low cost for them. You just, so now, and at the same time, it's also like a sort of farm team, where some people, if they find that they get someone there who's actually not just some, not just someone there for that, but there's someone who really seriously wants to go fight. But ultimately in the end, most of the people who fight for LET are actually just Pakistanis, mostly, or they'll say they're Kashmiris, but whatever. But they're Pakistanis, Punjabis, really, so. They don't have too many. Although there have been like foreigners who have died in fighting for LAT and so on, but mostly they're Pakistanis. But anyway, so 9/11 happens. We were sitting, we're sitting around trying to figure out what are we going to do, because at this point in the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, there's the Pentagon is in flames. The FBI is combing through the community trying to find out who these people were, and they're discovering that some of the people were living in the north. A couple of the people were living in the Northern Virginia area. You had Anwar al-Awlaki was the imam at our mosque there. So he's so it turns out that they quickly found out that a couple of those guys he had known, Anwar al-Awlaki had known when he was in San Francisco or San Diego or whatever. So there's this. Pressure. You've got Humvees and soldiers in the DC area. It was just a lot of, and also there was just the trauma of the events. Obviously, it was a horrific thing, and also the knowledge that now the Muslim community is going to be really under a lot of scrutiny, and part of that scrutiny is going to be looking at people like us who are, we suddenly realize that we're like, looking really crazy at this point. When 9/11 happened, I had a friend of mine was in Kashmir at that exact time. You know, so it's like we realize that we're not going to be looked on too kindly, and so we asked a local scholar to give us some advice on what we should do, and he gave us the very terrible advice that we should all leave the United States, and and we should go help the mujahideen. And he didn't specify which mujahideen, but he said anywhere in the world or whatever. But it seemed to be at least somewhat clear that to some extent he was talking about the Taliban, to defend the Taliban against the impending attack. That even at that time, this was like 3 days after 9/11. So his speech was so charismatic, and it was so it was based on this idea that look, it doesn't matter. Those guys did something wrong, but they're Muslims, and it's our duty to defend them, even if we don't agree with what they did. And so you see now at this point that the mentality that I had of now I'm easily manipulated to go yet another step, or even half step, beyond that. And I despised Al-Qaeda. I actually have my lawyers gave this email chain to my judge at my sentencing. In August of 2001, I was in a huge, bitter debate with some people about how Ayman Zawahiri, was a retarded. That was my word. I know it's not a politically correct, term now, but that was, I was attacking him, and I was being attacked, and I really couldn't stand Al-Qaeda at all for their for their nihilistic attitude and for ruining what I saw as that, again, that good foreign legion thing, but anyway, so, but I fell for it, and I helped these guys go to Lashkar-e-Taiba, where, I at least had some inkling that it's possible that they would have tried to get eventually to join the Taliban, and I have to own that. I have to admit that, even though that they didn't, I wasn't sure that was going to happen. I was just trying to help, them get to outside of the United States and get to go be with mujahideen, as the guy had told us. And I myself left to go to Bosnia, even though I took my family to Bosnia, even though I had actually originally tried to get to Pakistan, but I couldn't get a visa. So I go to Bosnia. Now, when I landed in Bosnia, I saw immediately, I came out of the bus station. I took the bus from Sarajevo to Zenica, where my wife was from, and I got off the bus station, and I saw these guys who had been officials in the Katibat Mujahideen in the Arab Brigade. These were Bosnians, but they had been high officials in that brigade. And they said, "Hey, Ismail, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, well, it doesn't, I'm here because, I left America, and we have to help the Muslims regardless of whether they're right or wrong." And, so they looked at each other, and they looked at me, and they're like, rolled their eyes, and they're like, "Come on, let's have coffee." So I go with them, and they're like, "Listen, first of all, I don't know who told you that." They're like, but we have no obligation to help these people. They said, "These people are the Taliban. They made their bed. Now they need to lie in it." And they're like, and these Al-Qaeda, they didn't ask us. He said they didn't ask us if this was something good to do, for Muslims or for the Mujahideen in Bosnia. He said they didn't ask us this. They just went and did it. We don't know who these people are. And then actually they had some theory that bin Laden was actually working for the Saudi government, and this was all some sort of, I don't know what, they had some crazy conspiracy theory about that. But the bottom line is that I immediately realized, especially because these were people that I really, really respected, I immediately realized that I had made a horrible mistake, and I had been fooled. And one of them says in Bosnian, sheikh each, which means, so is the sheikh going to go too? Like the one who advised you all this, is he going to go off? And,
yeah.
And the reality is that he actually stayed. He stayed in America, and he wound up getting his PhD, and and I'm off. I'm off. Off here in Bosnia, and the other guy's off in Pakistan, and so I had been manipulated. I'd been manipulated, and I also at that time started realizing. I started to feel like an idiot in that I had wasted a lot of time, of my own time, my wife's time, my children's time, in bouncing around to different places, chasing something, that didn't exist, and I eventually just realized that I wanted a normal existence, and it had dawned on me that I had been, under a lot of self-delusion for many years. So I came, that started the process of a lot of of introspection, of self-reflection. And I wound up coming back to America about 8 months later. I tried to make a go of it in Bosnia, but just couldn't get the income going. So I came back with my family, came back to America. But when I came back, the FBI was already investigating who this group of people were that, went off to, Pakistan and Bosnia and whatever. And they had already had a grand jury going. And when I got back, I started, I still tried to live my life. I started a website that it was called thetrueword.com, which doesn't exist anymore, but it's on archive, or the Wayback Machine. You can find it. So trueword.com was like my attempt. It was myself, my friend Amir Butler from Australia, and another guy, Shibli Zaman, from Texas, where we started the site. And the site was like dedicated to, on the one hand, sort of strongly and assertively explaining the Islamic position, the Muslim position of the Muslims, when it came to sort of world affairs and so on, but at the same time, like really being against extremism and against Al-Qaeda, against clash of civilizations. And really that approach is my approach today, which is like, I'm for I'm for Islam. I'm for the vision of, that Islam has in terms of, living your faith in the world, not keeping it in a box somewhere, but at the same time being against extremism, because that's not extremism, and being very, very just as assertive against extremism as I am against the extremism of believing that religion, the only place for religion is in your private home. I don't believe that at all. It's not even possible conceptually, to separate your most deeply held beliefs about the meaning of life from how you live your life in the world. So even that's an illusion. So that's what we were doing with that website. And I wound up getting arrested, ultimately being charged with dozens of things. Originally, it was just the Neutrality Act. In other words, actually, the official language of the act is setting on foot a military expedition against a friendly nation. In this case, the friendly nation was India, and also Russia. That was also part of it as well, because initially, remember, the thing was Chechnya, and then a bunch of gun charges related to what guns that were used or carried or whatever in the Pakistan training camps. And so because I was like I got the aiding and abetting charges for helping other people go off and, shoot guns in Pakistan's, in the training camps in Pakistan. And then that indictment was superseded with another indictment charging me with aiding and abetting in a conspiracy to help the Taliban, to help Al-Qaeda, although that was eventually dropped. Actually, all of these were eventually dropped, except for I wound up pleading guilty to aiding and abetting the use of a firearm in relation to a crime of violence. The crime of violence was the conspiracy to violate the Neutrality Act, and the gun was used by someone in the camp in Pakistan. So it was basically aiding and abetting. And then another aiding and abetting the carrying of a RPG in this training camp by someone who just was carrying the RPG as part of the training. So I pleaded guilty to those two charges, and I was sentenced to 20 years. This was in 2003, and they dropped the terrorism charge, and they dropped the material support and the treason and the supporting the Taliban. They dropped all that.
20 years is a long time for. In general, but also it's a long time for, at least in my mind, for what you actually were charged with. Those two things. And I'm sure they also looked at the other things and they were like, all right.
Well, the thing is that this was 2003, and it was, very shortly after 9/11, and the FBI has said to me, or told my lawyers that recently that had it not been immediately after 9/11, they would not have charged us in the same way that they charged. So much of what you eventually, so much of what you go to prison for, depends on how prosecutors choose to charge you, because the prosecutors have a lot of discretion, and they can charge the same thing, same course of conduct many different ways, which, by the way, actually has a very important effect on racial disparities in prison, with respect to blacks, whites, and Hispanics, and so on. Many of the disparities in prison populations is often related to how prosecutors choose to charge people, even if it's unconsciously. But anyway, so I don't complain about it, because it's my my conduct was my choice, and I chose to put myself in that situation. So I don't. I told them. I said, look, I appreciate hearing that, but that's not why. That's not something that it's not my business. It's not my business. If you guys feel like you would have done it differently, it's not upon me to sit here and think, oh, you should have done it differently. That's not. Because when you think that way, then you live in bitterness and you live in resentment, and that's not good for one's own self. So as a matter of fact, one of the things that I greatly benefited from in prison was the intense. The opportunity for intense self-reflection, and it was an opportunity that I had that I think most people don't have. I was in solitary confinement for a period of 2.5 years. So when you're just alone with yourself, I was in prison for a total of 13 and a half and 2.5 in solitary. When you're alone with yourself, you have a lot of time to ask yourself, how did I get here? And as a matter of fact, that started right after I'd been arrested. I was sitting there like in the holding cell in the courthouse, and I'm like, how did I get here? What is the what series of decisions and thoughts did I have, and that got me to this place? Because clearly I'm not in the right place, So
right, and
at some point
it seems like a very gradual, like the logic. Each logical jump makes sense, And
yes.
I would say this, I used to work with people with disabilities, and I used to train caregivers, and caregivers who ended up abusing clients. It's not like they were sadistic and they wanted to work with people with disabilities so they could beat somebody up. Although I'm sure there are people like that. It's like every moment. Like they start out, saying, well, it's my job to make sure they behave in public, right?
Yes,
and,
exactly.
And then and that's like a normal, you want people to behave in public. And then but that puts you on a track, and each step makes sense, because you can't, people, especially people with intellectual disabilities, you can't control them. And so, if you see it as your job to control them, then you're going to have a hard time, and you're going to become bitter each day. But each day makes sense to you, and each step makes sense to you. And then you end up grabbing a client to throw them in a car because and somebody sees you and reports you, and you get charged with abuse, and you're like, how did I? And you think the mistake you make is grabbing them and throwing them in the car, but the mistake was at the very beginning. When you said that your job was to control the clients, and that doomed you. It's like, okay, well, if that's your attitude, then in 5 years you're going to abuse a client.
You really hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it. And you just have to. The human being has to be constantly vigilant over oneself, to avoid those kind of things, because really all of us can fall into it if we slip. I had a conversation with Eric Rudolph, who's the guy who was behind the 1996 bombing of the Olympics and many other different, sort of terrorist attacks. And
yeah, my dad is going to be very
was
excited to hear that, because we went to the Olympics in Atlanta, and then the bombing happened. We weren't there at the time, but the bombing happened, and on the way back, we hear about Eric Rudolph, and he's on the run basically. And my dad thinks that who's very into conspiracy theories, and he has a very paranoid kind of mentality sometimes. It's harmless, but it's interesting. But he was convinced that we saw Eric Rudolph in Social Circle, Georgia, on the way home. And so the FBI definitely has a big file on my dad of all the letters that he sent them for we saw Eric Rudolph. So,
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I don't know. Maybe he might.
If you have a reunion, ask him. I don't know.
Yeah, well, hopefully I never have a reunion with him. But yeah, well, so I had a conversation with him. So I told him. Now here, okay. So to set that up, so I was in a prison unit called the Communication Management Unit in Terre Haute, Indiana, the federal prison there. And I was there with a guy named Stephen Jordy. So Stephen Jordy was a guy who had plotted to burn down his church because his church was insufficiently anti-abortion.
Wow.
So, so I'm talking to Stephen, and Stephen says to me, look, he says, if you saw a man with a gun to a baby's head about to kill the baby, would you be justified in killing the man? And I said, yeah, definitely. And he says, so what's the difference between that and an abortion doctor who's, about to kill a baby in the womb? And what's the difference between, why would you not be justified in killing the doctor? And I said to him, well, to be honest, I don't know. I can't explain to you why that would be wrong. Something tells me that's wrong, but I don't know. I can't really answer that. And so I was tell him, I kind of see your point, And then, so when I later, a couple of years later, when I met Eric Rudolph in the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, so I was with him at the recreation during the recreation period. So I was talking to Eric, and I said, yeah, I said I kind of understand where you're coming from, and I told him I had this conversation with Stephen Jordy. And, I related the conversation to him, and he says, oh, yeah, Stephen Jordy is one of those liberals. So what do you mean? So what do you mean he's a liberal? He says, because that's a liberal argument. The liberal argument is to say, is to stop at the doctor. He says, but
wow.
you can't. Yeah. He says, but you can't. He says you can't stop at the doctor. He said, I believe that you have to, you have to go after the government that allows the doctor to kill a baby. And so yeah. So at that point, it's like, all right, well, why is that wrong? There are things that you can say about why that's wrong, and there are things you can say about why it's wrong to kill the abortion quote unquote doctor. But they're not as convincing as don't let the baby get murdered. Don't let the baby get murdered. It has much more force than, well, if society were run by vigilantes, then we would all be miserable. That sounds almost like utilitarian. So anyway, you can see how people, I could see how, and look, if you talk to, I've sat there with Eric Rudolph, and we discussed, After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre. We discussed, he's reading these books, and we're having normal conversations like a normal human being, and he's not just like some bouncing off the walls lunatic. This is a guy who just, something in him was just like, this is really, really important, and I'm gonna do something about it. And
yeah, there was a guy, growing up. I grew up very conservative Presbyterian, and there was a pastor in our circles who I never met him. His name's Paul Jennings Hill, and he is the guy who assassinated the abortion doctor. And
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and he wrote like a defense because he was excommunicated from the OPC, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, but he wrote a defense of what he did, and every piece of it is logical. And I'm curious. I mean, I have the personality where I'm not going to say it would be easy to radicalize me, but I think that I have a personality where I'm comfortable believing that something is wrong, even if no one else around me thinks it's wrong.
Yeah.
And most people aren't comfortable with that. Most people want to have the same sense of morality as everybody around them, and so it would be really hard to get me to do something that I believe is wrong, which is good. But I would also, become very obsessed with things and get online. And so I could see myself, or at least not myself, but someone with the type of brain that I have, becoming convinced step by step and then ending up, someplace monstrous.
Yeah. I mean, it's very scary. It's very scary. And like I say, there are people who arrive at this type of action or whatever from different angles. Like I've known guys who have, who have also followed that sort of logic. But then when you look at them and you look at their background, it's sort of like also that, well, you're from like, for example, I knew a white guy, convert to Islam. He had converted to Islam in prison. His family was, his mom was a crack addict. He was in foster care. He was abused as a child. He was, and so he goes to jail. But he latched on to this sort of, radical, belief, almost like, he was following that sort of logic, but he was also, there was something else operating there too. There was also this, he just had this feeling of desperation. He had a feeling of hopelessness. He had a feeling of meaninglessness. He had, so that's not what motivated Eric Rudolph, I don't think, and that's not what motivated me, certainly, and I don't think that's what would motivate you. But there are certain types of, there are other things going on in people's minds, where it's not really about the logic, and it's not really about the. That's why I believe that, and I know this for a fact because I've lived with dozens and dozens of people who have come to prison for terrorism-related or extremism-related cases, and for many of these people, that what you say to them to try to persuade them that they're wrong, it's one type of conversation that you would have with someone like Eric Rudolph, and it's another type of conversation that you would have with someone who is like the type of person I'm talking about, and you don't, and it's not about trying to explain to them that their logic is wrong. It's more like teaching them about empathy, or teaching them about what's important in life and how to be a good person and how to, so I just, there's no one size fits all to deal with this phenomenon,
So tell me about Richard Reed and your long correspondence with him, which is about everything that we've been talking about with the difference between the Foreign Legion versus the sort of Al Qaeda.
Yeah. So Richard Reed is an interesting character. He's he's a guy who, first of all, he's not as dumb as he appears, in his pictures and his just the sort of general commonly thought view of him is that he's just this big dummy, but when you talk to him, he's actually he's actually pretty intelligent, on a certain level. And he also his family was, comes from a broken home. His dad, I think, was Jamaican, and his mom was white English lady. And He went to jail at an early age. Young age. He converted to Islam there. He got involved. And the thing about London was a very odd place in the 90s because there was this whole sort of expatriate Al Qaeda presence there. Not only Al Qaeda but other various radical groups. So he somehow or another got hooked up with them. Goes off to Afghanistan, and in Afghanistan he's there while these guys are training for the 9/11 attacks, and so he's part of that same group. They train him as part of what's going to be the second wave and it's supposed to be a wave after the 9/11 attacks. So the 9/11 attacks happen, and he goes to Paris, and then he has the shoe bomb, and he gets ready to come to the United States, and he tried to blow up his bomb that was in his shoe on the plane. Now he claims, and he says that when he actually decided not to go through with it. This is what he says. So he doesn't agree. He doesn't say that. He says it wasn't that it just went out or he couldn't get it lit. As the story goes, he says that he actually decided to put it out because he saw some kids on the plane and decided that he didn't feel good about it. I actually don't know what the truth of that. I don't know what the truth of that is. But anyway, so so I was with him in ADX and the Florence Supermax, and we carried on a long correspondence. We had to be correspondents because we're, in ADX, it's very difficult to talk to other inmates. So we're writing notes and sending them back and forth to one another through various means. And through that, way, we built when I would send him a letter, I would write it on, I would use carbon paper so that I could keep a copy of mine and, of what I had written. And then his letters back to me, I would keep those. So I wound up accumulating, just this over a year and a half, our correspondence. And also we would talk when we would go out to recreation or something, and when they would take us out that way. But, anyway, so what we mainly were arguing about was the permissibility, for example, of killing civilians, the permissibility of the 9/11 attacks, which he had agreed with, whether or not Al Qaeda was a good organization or not, whether Bin Laden was, whether it was right to see him as some sort of representative of the Muslims, whether what he was doing was good, or whether Al Qaeda's project was, as he claimed, some sort of had some sort of roots in actual traditional Islam, or what I was claiming, which was that it was an innovation and had more roots in Leninism than it did in classical Islam. And so all this is we're going back and forth, and it was really interesting also to realize is that I was kind of stunned at first or amazed by his level of or his ability to cite classical sources. And, he's saying, oh, well, Ibn Rushd said this and Bidayat al-Mujtahid and, he's quoting all these classical sources. But I asked him, like, where did you study? How did you learn this stuff? And he's like, oh, this is from Abu Qatada's book. So Abu Qatada is this guy in London who, was this guy in London who was an Al Qaeda, representative. So this is what it is, right? What it is that Al Qaeda and ISIS and other groups, what they have done is that they have scoured through classical sources and cherry picked this sort of these cherry-picked different statements and different things and compiled them into like ebooks and pamphlets and things that, and that seem to support their narrative. But in reality, they have created something that is not actually Islam. And that's why people, people say, oh, well, is it actually, is this Islam or is it not Islam? I mean, well, in a way it is, in the sense that, yes, these people all cite, as ISIS, you see this phenomenon with ISIS, they cite the Quran, yes, they cite Hadith, yes, they cite classical scholars, but they're citing them they're citing interpretations of these things that are not broadly accepted, and and what they've done is radically isolated these various out of context comments, or in many cases, rare opinions or opinions that are not accepted, compiled them into one sort of methodology or one sort of version of the religion that no one, not even the people that they are citing, would have accepted. And so so there's a saying that one of that Ali ibn Abi Talib, Ali the cousin of the Prophet, when the Khawarij, which was a sect that rebelled against the Muslims and began killing the Muslims, and very related in many ways to ISIS and Al Qaeda. So when they began doing that, and they're citing the statement, they're saying whoever does not rule by or judge by God's word, then he is a disbeliever. So Ali said to them, "Kalimatul haq yuridu biha al-batil," a word of truth by which falsehood is intended. So that's what they're doing. They're taking things. They have a goal which is false, and they're distorting things in the service of that goal, and that's what he's doing. So I have that correspondence, and that correspondence should be soon. I think sometime this summer, published as a book.
Oh wow!
And
That'd be great.
I need to annotate it because there's a lot of very obscure things. I think for some readers won't understand what the references are. So I'll do some annotation of that, but that should be published sometime this summer, or possibly spring. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. But it'll be a useful resource for trying to see how these people think. And one of the very, very critical aspects of this modern phenomenon of Al-Qaeda-ism or ISISism is that it's predicated on rulership. They believe that the current rulers of the Muslim world are illegitimate. They're all disbelievers and apostates, and that it's mandatory for every Muslim to acknowledge them as apostates and to fight and kill them. And
or you could always just get the United States, to do it, attack
right.
us so that then we retaliate by killing them.
Right. And by the way, this is one of their strategies, is the reason for 9/11 and the reason for the Manchester attacks and the 7/7 attacks and those sort of thing is in order to invite retaliation, which causes chaos and hardship and harm and death and destruction, because that's what they thrive in, and these groups require, and this ideology requires chaos. It requires harm. It requires death. It requires images of dead children that can be shared. ISIS and Al Qaeda require dead Muslim children for for their goal to succeed. And if they don't get that, then they'll fizzle out.
It's interesting because when we were talking about your story, Bosnia was very clear to you, and seems clear to I think most people in terms of preventing a genocide. And then ever since Bosnia, you were seeking that same experience and, more importantly, that same clarity of cause, and by provoking these world powers to attacking them and creating devastation. It's almost like they're trying to recreate that sort of clarity. Where
absolutely.
If we can get to a world war, then things will become very clear, right? So attacking Normandy, attacking Hitler, all that stuff. That's super clear. Well, it wasn't so clear in 1933 or something.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And so this is I think the goal of a lot of radicals on both Muslim and obviously the person who wanted to or killed all the people in New Zealand is accelerationism, where the goal is to create the conditions under which your message will resonate, because it doesn't resonate now as much because people have Muslim neighbors that seem fine, and things are complicated, and there's political issues that are gray and hard to figure out who the good side is and who the bad side is. But if we accelerate it to the point where there's just two sides and there's a clear bad side, then we have that like nice sense of clarity.
You have hit the nail on the head. It's what Hitler did in Poland, with the ethnic Germans there, where he, he encouraged, through the Nazi Party, they encouraged ethnically German Poles to. I think there was an incident where they took over on Nazi encouragement. They took over some kind of they took over a radio station, and then there was a massive crackdown by the Poles against the ethnic Germans, and then this was one of the incidents that Hitler used through the suffering of the German ethnic Germans in Poland that he himself had instigated. He used that as one of his excuses to invade. Or the Serbs, for example, the Serbs did this with ethnic Serbs in Croatia. They would instigate some incident that would result in a Croatian crackdown on ethnic Serbs in Croatia, and then the Serbs used the Serbian army, the so-called Yugoslav army, the Serbian army really at that point, used that as an excuse to invade portions of Croatia. So this is absolutely it's a devilish, it's a satanic plan, but that's the plan. That's the plan that they have, and
today
and people fall into it.
Yeah, I mean, today is the it's the 4-year anniversary of the Emmanuel AME shooting here in Charleston, where Dylan Roof, who was obsessed with Rhodesia and being, which also had a kind of foreign legion thing, where people from all over were flocking there to defend the white people. His goal in killing the 9 people, including one who was a friend of mine, his goal was to provoke a race war, right? And so he was like, well, black people and white people don't like each other. And you can read his manifesto. He's like, white people and black people, they don't actually like each other, but they get along. And so, but if I do this, it will clarify the sides, and he's come from a broken home, and so I think there's this desire for things to be very clear.
Very clear. Or look at so there's a personal desire in many people for things to be very clear, and you see this. By the way, this is why you often find people on the autism spectrum. Well, I don't say you often find them. You find many people who have gotten involved in these sort of cases. They are somewhere on the autism spectrum. I've seen it over and over and over again. And I can give names, but so there was one guy with us at the communications management unit in Marion, Illinois. So he, this is just an example because I knew many people like this, but he would freak out if anyone moved to the tables in the chow hall, and he wouldn't come eat if he found that the tables had been moved, and so he was one of these guys. I mean, everything had to be black and white and very clear. And that's how he saw the world, but that's on an individual level. But then also, this is a way, as you said, to manipulate people. Look at Helter Skelter, the Manson family's plan. They also wanted to spark a race war, and they murdered these people and then wrote with their blood on the walls "pigs," and they were originally tried to portray these murders as having been carried out by blacks in order to spark a race war, which was what Helter Skelter was, their name for that race war that was supposed to take place. Or, for that matter, look at the actions of Steve Bannon, who wanted, and we found out in this, in a recent book that was written, that he wanted this so-called Muslim ban because he wanted Muslims and leftists protesting against Trump during the campaign, so that he could rally his, the sort of it was part of the populist message, so he could rally, so-called deplorables, and Hillary fell right into it. Hillary helped that, and to create this polarization, and that's why you saw the Russians, for example, supporting, on the one hand, running Facebook pages that were like, fake, black militant groups. They're arming, they're training, and then on the other hand, running, anti-black racist groups, and then pitting them against each other, even setting up actual events.
I went to that. I went to that event.
That's crazy.
The main event that you're talking about was. It was in Houston. It was at the Islamic Dawah Center in Houston, and there was this white supremacist rally. And I was in Houston for a show, and I had all these Muslims who were like, "You should come by this thing because there's all these white supremacists coming." And so there was an event on Facebook for the white supremacists to protest. It was, and then there was a counter event for everybody to defend the mosque and stuff like that. And you went, and it was really boring. But then we found out 2.5 years later that both events, both the white supremacist and the defend the mosque events, have been created by Russian trolls. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, okay, I got played. Like I was there, literally there.
That's fascinating. Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and so it's in the interest of the enemies of, of humanity, really. It's a satanic thing. It's in their interest to, to pit people against one another, and that's why. That's why we have to resist it. We have to and I don't agree. I don't think that. I'm really frustrated with Muslims for falling into it and playing a role. Like, why would you indulge in identity politics when you know, or you should know, that identity politics is the very vehicle by which the concord of this, the society that we have in America is being eroded. So identity politics is not the tool of liberation or the tool of securing rights. Identity politics is what's going to cause you to lose your rights, because when that concord breaks down, then it's all up for grabs, and we're not going. The progressives are not going to be able to save us. The progressives are not going to be the ones. They're not going to have any power to, to protect Muslims from from the dystopia that will arise when this social compact that we have falls apart. And so we have to oppose it. And we can't fall into it. That's again, you just can't allow yourself to fall for the it doesn't matter now that, it doesn't matter whether we're right or wrong. It doesn't matter whether, what we have to do is we have to stick with our side. No, you don't do that. Don't fall into that. The side that we need to be on is on the side of all of us living together, with some sort of common goal and some sort of concept of common good in mind. That's the side that we have to be on. And anyone who's not on that side is not on my side. That's what we have to realize.
And I think there's a kind of personality trait, and it's also a social personality trait similar to the wanting things to be black and white, where it rejects a kind of messy pluralism.
Exactly.
And I like the idea of pluralism being messy and being chunky. And where, and you find that a lot of times when you go into, especially other countries where there's like a monarch and there's like Christian cities and there's like Muslim like towns, and like in those towns there's like it's almost like a little Christendom or like a little and then you go down the street and it's like not. And it's very messy, and the rulers have to figure out, how to manage all of that, and they aren't trying to figure out how to manage it by appealing to some kind of universal, rational set of rules. It's just like, well, let's just hopefully try and figure out how to get along. I was thinking about this when it comes to the question of like, should Christian businesses have to make cakes for gay people, right? And it's like, well, and everyone seems to be like, all right, what's the principle that we have, like, you know, as far as liberty versus, like, is it property rights? Do they own the cakes and that's why they can do it?
It's feelings.
And it's like,
it's feelings.
But like, I'm just like, why can't it just be like, the rules are that we have to get along and not do anything that will like accelerate war and conflict and like, and then like, but then let's say that like all the bakeries are owned by Christians and no gay person can ever find a cake. Like, okay, well then that changes things, right? Like that's a big deal then.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
no,
like,
so on this,
well, why can't it be this kind of messy ad hoc kind of patchwork solution?
Yeah. Well, okay. So you just open up a huge can of worms. Okay. So first of all, I agree with you totally. I mean, about messiness. Go to Bosnia, for example. Okay, when they're not fighting and killing each other, they're actually they actually have a really interesting. Okay, I'll use the Muslim area of Bosnia because the Muslim area of Bosnia is really, to me, the closest to like the traditional like Ottoman or imperial, even an imperial way of running of operation, where you have Christian neighborhoods, you have Christian towns, you have Christian areas, you have Muslim areas, and you know, no one's trying to say like, oh, but how are we going to integrate and how are we got to force everyone to speak the same language? I mean, they do speak the same language there, but you know, the point is that that's not you don't have that obsession of homogenizing everything. So there's this idea that pluralism only works when everyone is homogenous, you know, and which is like not pluralism, you know.
That's a contradiction.
Yeah, it's a contradiction. So why you know, it's offensive to the modern nation state that there be different dialects and that there be different languages and that there be different different religions and different groups, you know. But what's really interesting about America and what is like, you know, kind of shocks many people from, you know, say like Western Europe, as you come here and you see like, okay, there's the Amish over there, and here are Jewish neighborhoods over there where many people don't even speak English, and there's, you know, the Amish over there is speaking German, and there or some old version of German. Here's these Italian neighborhoods where people are speaking, you know, some version of Italian that doesn't even exist anymore because you know, Italy annihilated its you know, all the variant, you know, the non-Northern Italian dialects, you know, and that with, you know, and you know, in France, for example, France, when, you know, the new you know, when in Republican France, they deliberately annihilated all dialects and languages that were not the Parisian dialect of French, and that became French. And what, you know, the languages that people were speaking outside of that couldn't be tolerated in the new vision of the state being the religion. So what I love about America is that, like the older imperial orders that somewhat still exist in some places in the world, we don't have this, or let's say there's not this overwhelming desire to homogenize. There is there's a tension there between that, and then on the other hand, that sort of live and let live, you know, and that sort of why? Because the American idea was that America was not actually founded as an ethno-state. You know, America was founded as you know, a sort of we're all, you know, our polity is based on the idea that we all agree to certain things. We all agree to certain ideas, and you know, the idea, for example, that all men are, all people are created equal, and that sort of thing. And then we agree to live together with this common good in mind. Now, yes, did the reality always equal that? No, it certainly didn't. I mean, slavery, and you had the genocide of the Native Americans, and you had you had persecution of Catholics, persecution of Mormons, and so on. So you had those things, but we're talking about there's at least an ideal that can be appealed to, and there's a sense of what is right and what's wrong. So you bring that into the context of the cake thing, all right? So let's say that I run a mosque and I need to put a roof on it, and so I go ask a Christian carpenter, and I say, or roofer, and I say, hey, I'd like to hire you to put a roof on my mosque, and he says, well, look, no offense or anything, but I believe that by doing so, I would be disobeying God, because I would be assisting you in worshiping in a religion that I think is destined for hell. So I just believe that I would be disobeying God and incurring sin by doing that, even a mortal sin, perhaps. I don't know. So what I would say to that person is, I would say, oh, you know what? I totally understand where you're coming from. Let me go find someone else. And so I don't see that as being problematic at all. Now, what if I couldn't find anyone? What if the only roofers in the whole area were Christians? Now that is admittedly a somewhat different situation, but how am I going to resolve that? I'm not going to. I don't see the way to resolve that as going to court and trying to shut that guy down, and and so when it comes to the cake issue, so the issue is not, I'm not going to sell this person a cake because I perceive this person to be to be a practicing homosexual. That's not to me, that's not an appropriate reason to not to serve someone. The issue there is, I'm not going to sell this person a cake because this person has told me that this cake is going to be used, that I'm going to be creating a wedding cake for this person, and that's involving me. Yeah, that's involving me in endorsing or participating somehow in sin. So if that person had the correct way of being a neighbor, that gay person, he would say, oh, I understand where you're coming from. I wouldn't want to be put in a position where I would be, feeling as if I'm being forced to disobey God or be run out of business. So I don't want to put you in that position, because I wouldn't want to be put in that position. And we understand each other that way. What's to me, it's what's un-American and what's just not being a good person and not being a good neighbor is to demand that everyone endorse my practices and endorse my beliefs. And what's really offensive to people, is to be told that they disapprove of what someone disapproves of what they're doing. That someone out there believes that what this person is doing is sinful and is bad. That's what gets people. That's what irks them, because they can't stand to be told that. And you know what? For me, I don't care if someone believes that what I'm doing is wrong and I'm going to hell for it. Then I'm not gonna take offense to that, and I'm not gonna try to shut you down because you don't want to endorse my beliefs. And so I just think that somehow or another, the people who are wrong in this case and similar cases are those who refuse to put themselves in the position of those other people.
And it seems like, I mean, for a lot of people, they want that same kind of clarity. They don't want some kind of messy. Well, in some certain circumstances you do this, in some others you do this.
Yeah,
it's you are like, unredeemable, and and I mean, not that they are like terrorists or anything like that, but it's
right,
like there's that same kind of. I mean, I feel this a lot where I have I have like a lot of OCD, and I really want this kind of clarity that without becoming virtuous, right? So I don't have to become virtuous. I can skip past all of that and just learn some rules. And learn either learn some rules or learn who the bad guys are, And if I can learn who the bad guys are, then I can just, dedicate all of that, all of my creative energies to destroying them and and getting them canceled or whatever. And but if this is, if sin and if vice is something that afflicts all of us, and it can be, counterintuitive, where, you think your problem is one thing and it turns out it's not, and you're like, oh, well, that's okay. And I don't know, I fight this a lot. I fight the idea of just becoming wholesale involved in something, and like that there's a kind of high that I can get when something becomes clear to me. And I experienced that with, my conversion to Catholicism, where, and I still have that, where it, like, to me, like, oh, everything's clear now. And then now I'm like, this past month or so, I'm like realizing, like, oh, a lot of what I thought, like, was true was not true. Like, in the sense of, like, I didn't completely convert. Like, there was still leftover stuff that I had thought, and I was like, oh, okay, my image of God is still very, very Calvinist, and like, so it's not as clear as I thought. And so, like, reading more and more, I'm like, okay, well, now it's clear, right? And then there's the high that comes from that, and then somebody mentions something, and it just messes your brain up, and you're like, oh, maybe it wasn't clear.
Very, very well said. Yeah, very well said. It's being addicted to that high of certainty. But on the other hand, if you don't have certain, there are things we can be certain of, and if you're not certain of some things, then maybe you're just not a very
right, and that's a kind of false humility, I think, where like you think you're being modest by saying that you can't know what's true or not.
And that's
definitely not modesty.
Yeah, Socrates would say that, like, he'd say, like, the only thing, more or less paraphrasing, the only thing I'm certain of is that I'm not certain of anything. But of course, he really was certain of many things, So I mean, when you read further into his, he actually did have principles that and he did have things that he was very certain of. But we're certain that we exist. We actually, Augustine talked about that. He said. He had some really brilliant argument about certainty. Like, he was mocking the skeptics, and he said, about, I can't repeat it right now, but there are it's false to say that we can't be certain about anything, for sure. And there are things we can be certain of. For example, I'll tell you, I went through a crisis of faith in prison because, I'm there, and I couldn't really, I was in a situation where my faith had been so wrapped up around activism, that when I could no longer be an activist and I was just locked up in a cell, it's sort of like, all right, well, what is my faith really then? Is it, if it's not just constant busy action in the world, then what is my faith really, and, so you have that stripped away, and what are you left with? And so I had to sit there and ask myself, like, what do I believe and why? Like, why do I believe this? And, I had to sit there and say, all right, I'd started with, all right, well, I believe in God. I know that. I know I believe in God. And I know that God is, merciful, all-knowing, all seeing, and, and giving, and generous. And I know I'm contingent on him. And, I just rebuilt my faith to understand why I believe what I believe. And then, the Quran, reading the Quran was, that helped me a great deal, because then so now I'm reading the Quran for the first time, and it seemed like I'm like reading the Quran not just for, explanations of how to justify something that I was, into, or I'm not reading the Quran now just in light of, in light of actions that I'm doing, or in light of, but I'm now reading the Quran as to understand, why I'm here, and what my existence means, and, and so on. So, and what my relationship is with my Creator and my Lord, so that had a big impact on me, because I came to realize that, especially in our day and age, which is so worldly focused, especially after the Protestant Revolution and after the spread of modernity, which is so, and obviously Marxism and its various flavors, and you have this SJW phenomenon, and so that, I don't think it's any great coincidence that this has become this activism, as religion has arisen, concomitantly with the decline in faith. It's just that reorientation of, the human beings from the heaven to the earth, which I think there's a loss there,
There's a really great quote by this theologian, Stanley Hauerwas. I just love this, where he's like sarcastically praying, and he says, God, you can take away my loves, but don't take away my hates, because then I won't know who I am anymore. You can take away you can take away anything that I love, but nothing that I hate, because then I won't have a reason for existence. And I think that's true of a lot of us.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, Ismail, thank you so much for coming on. This was very long and very lovely, and time went by so fast. But thank you again, and I really hope to have you on again.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you for the great conversation, and hope it wasn't too boring and tedious as I went on my
No, it was awesome.
Rants.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'll see you later.
Yep, see ya. That concludes another episode of Holy Wars. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, share it on social media, rate it 5 stars on iTunes, and donate to my Patreon. Every little bit helps this project keep moving forward. Until next time, I'm Jeremy McClellan. Thank you for listening.